Thank you everyone for joining me for the live studies week after week. My name is Ariel, ben-Lyman, HaNaviy, and the live internet studies are an hour and a half long. They're broken up into two segments. The first segment is entitled Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. We study topics related to prophecy, Book of Daniel, Olivet Discourse, Antichrist, Rapture, Mystery Babylon, Book of Revelation. We're going in that direction. If you can see on your screen, there's a little topical chart that shows that right now we're on topic 12, and we're really kind of going through Rapture views of final analysis right now. The last 30-minute part of the hour and a half long show is entitled A Trinitarian Response to Biblical Unitarianism, and it is an apologetic look at passages in the Bible that are argued historically from either a Trinitarian or a non-Trinitarian perspective. I'm taking the Trinitarian view, and we're allowing our imaginary opponent, biblicalunitarian.com, to take the non-Trinitarian perspective. And right now we're still looking through Micah 5, verse 2. So if those topics interest you, stick around for the whole show. Okay, let's jump in. We left off last week. Again, we're in topic 12, Rapture views of final analysis. And what we did is we allowed a pre-tribulational Christian denomination. Well, I don't know if they're a denomination, but they're a ministry called gotquestions.org to provide us with this look at pre-trib rapture. And the question that they put forth was, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-trib view of the rapture, pre-tribulationism? And we read the entire article. And what I noticed is that, obviously, again, gotquestions.org leans pre-trib. So what I noticed is that they're going to, even though they're going to show strengths and weaknesses of their position, they're going to downplay the weaknesses. In other words, I got the sense that they viewed these as perceived weaknesses and not real weaknesses in and of themselves. So in order to really get a different perspective from them, right after I did the show, I couldn't shake the feeling that I think what the viewers really were expecting, and I myself really kind of had an itching to do, was to provide my own actual review of the pre-trib perspective from a pre-wrath perspective. In other words, what do I think the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-trib view are? Now, in all fairness, Got Questions is going to examine all four of the views that I have been examining. So let me just show you. We've got these four views on any given discussion. We've got the pre-trib rapture here that I've been talking about quite a bit. We've got the mid-tribulation rapture here. We've got the post-tribulation rapture over here. And then we've got the pre-trib rapture, which is the view that I hold to. And each of the four views have similarities and differences. However, something that kind of ties them all together that I don't quite mention a lot, but I hope that you can kind of sense and figure it out, is that all of these views are kind of historic, what we might call premillennial, meaning they all believe in a literal millennium that's going to come, and they all believe that Jesus is going to return before the millennium, meaning he's going to return first and then actually establish the millennial kingdom, set it up, and then we go into 1,000-year millennium, a literal one. And so there are Christian eschatological systems that don't hold to millennium view, the kind of amillennial or post-millennial or something that effect. But all of these four views are premillennial. So they've got that similarity to them. So gotquestions.org is going to examine the strengths and weaknesses, i.e. theirs, of all four views. However, what I decided to do this week, and I hope that you can be excited right along with me, is that I kind of got excited about the idea of me providing my own critique of pre-tribulationism from a pre-wrath view. So I put together this week real quick this document. It's just an answer. It's not even a full-blown it's not meant to be long, but I just call it Prewrath Answers to Pre-Trib Problems. Meaning, when I say problems, they say GotQuestions.org call them strengths and weaknesses, and I don't need to reread all the strengths, but I do want to provide my answer to what I think they what people recognize as our weaknesses. So I just call this Prewrath Answers to Pre-Trib Problems. Okay, let's read down through this. Let's work. This is going to form our study for tonight. I don't know if it'll take a full hour. If it doesn't, that's fine. What I start off with is, and again, you'll have to watch last week's show to understand what I'm refuting or what I'm responding to. However, I put some brief representations of what they claim. So the way the format works is I'm going to present what I did is I broke their, they meaning GotQuestions.org. I took this article where they provided a few paragraphs worth of what they think are strengths, and then a few paragraphs worth of what they think are weaknesses. Again, notice that they say they call them perceived weaknesses because they don't really think that there's that many. They think that this is the position that is best represented by Scripture. Well, I took this article that they presented and I broke it up into 10 different paragraphs, and I just labeled them claim and response, and I tried to keep it kind of short. For the claim, I kind of summarized what they say, and then for the response, I provided my own thoughts on that particular claim. So that's the way it's going to go. So let's work down through this again. I believe this is really what the viewers were expecting when they saw the video that said, excuse me, they saw the video, watched the video that said strengths and weaknesses of the pre-trib. They thought, well, we didn't get to hear HaNaviy. We didn't hear Ariel's view. We just heard GotQuestions.org. Ariel, what do you think about the pre-trib view? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? Well, okay, so that's what you're going to get tonight. Prewrath Answers to Pre-Trib Problems by Ariel ben-Lyman HaNaviy. So you're going to get my understanding now of their strengths and their weaknesses. So we'll see what I have to say. Here we go. Here are brief refutational comments for each GotQuestions.org paragraph from a pre-wrath perspective, while acknowledging any points that align with the pre-wrath position. I'll end with a summary and conclusion for clarity. Okay. And when needed, I'll jump back and forth between the slides that show the graphics so we can figure out what I'm saying. Okay, let's start with paragraph 1. These are in no particular order other than they're the same order when I say paragraphs here, and I've got 10. They're in the same order as the paragraphs that GotQuestions.org presented the material. Okay, in their article, they start out with this claim. The rapture occurs before the tribulation, and the church is spared from the tribulation. All right, what's my response? Prewrath agrees that the church will be spared from God's wrath. However, it carefully distinguishes between Satan's persecution and God's wrath. The Bible teaches that believers will endure part of the Great Tribulation, i.e. Satan's wrath, before being delivered at the sixth seal. That is, read Revelation 6:12-17, which marks the onset of God's wrath, not the entire 7 years. So right away, what pre-wrath does is it looks at the strength of what pre-trib is trying to present, and that in a broad sense, there are enough passages in the Bible to give us the sense that as believers, we are exempt from some kind of significant trial or time frame that's going to befall planet Earth. Some type of activity that will be orchestrated by God. And so we get this sense, we live with this bit of tension, I believe, when we read verses, like 1 Thessalonians 5:9, God has not appointed us unto wrath, but to obtain salvation, or I believe that's the passage. And there are other passages where we see, like we're going to talk about this later on, Revelation 3:10, where Jesus says to the Philadelphian church, because you've kept the word of my faith, I'm going to keep you from the hour of trial. And pre-tribbers kind of latch on to these passages and say, see, this is proof that God's not going to put his bride through his wrath. And so they build their case based on this kind of theological principle that God wouldn't punish his bride. Because the wrath of God is portrayed in the Bible as punishment against wickedness, punishment against what I call the uns, the U-Ns, the uns. And what I mean by that is the wrath of God is described as punishment and retribution against the unbelievers, against the unrighteous, against the ungodly, against the unfaithful, against the unrepentant. So it's punishment against the uns, the U-Ns, the uns. And this makes sense theologically. And I think that's where that's a big strength of the of the pre-trib camp. I think that's a strong point that they're bringing out. And I don't think that's something that they need to back down on. Indeed, when I watch debates between pre-tribbers and post-tribbers, you remember when we go back to our chart here, the pre-tribbers say that all of this, let's draw that circle again. All of this, they say, is God's wrath. And God's wrath is composed of tribulation on the front end and great tribulation on the back end, or for the first half and the second half. And they've got all this bad stuff. And because God's wrath isn't supposed to be directed at believers, then it's necessary, the pre-trib camp says, it's necessary for God to allow for the church to be raptured before all this bad stuff happens. And that theological principle, I think, is solid. And what they're doing is they're trying to combat the post-trib rapture, which says we're going to go through all of this stuff and then the rapture is going to happen. And the way that we're going to survive, if at all, through all the bad stuff, i.e. God's wrath being poured out on planet Earth, the way we as Christians, this is what post-trib says, the way we're going to survive is either A, God is going to supernaturally protect us like he did in the past to the children of Israel, or maybe the post-trib wrath has imagined that there will be a rapture before the final wrath at the very end, and thus there's a separate version of post-trib that teaches post-trib pre-wrath. But either way, the majority of God's wrath is experienced by believers. And so when we talk about passages that illustrate the principle of God not punishing his bride because she's not one of the uns, well, then the post-tribbers kind of start to fall apart in their theology because they can't explain the idea why God wouldn't punish his bride. They just say, well, he's not really punishing her. He's just leaving her on earth while he punishes everyone around her, and somehow he supernaturally protects her while he punishes all the rest of the world. But he doesn't have to take the Christians out of the way in order to punish the world. He's smart enough and powerful enough to figure out who's his bride and who's not, and punish the world around his bride, but leave the bride in place. Okay, I get that speculative perspective, that kind of hypothesis or that supposition, but I'm going to have to give it to the pre-tribbers this time. I think the greater weight of Scripture seems to indicate that there are enough promises and the principles built in that, yes, God could protect Christians, but the time of God's wrath doesn't seem to be characterized in that way. Okay, I could be wrong there, but that's what I get a sense. So I'm going to give that one to the pre-tribbers. However, the pre-wrathers say there's an easier way to solve this dilemma of, is the church going to go through God's wrath or not? And the easy way is to step in between the pre-tribbers and the post-tribbers and say, what if we look at the terminology? What if we look at the passages that talk about the bad stuff that's going to happen on planet Earth, and we carefully begin to distinguish and remember that there's another player involved when it comes to the bad stuff, and that very important player is Antichrist himself. Satan has a time promised by God, and allowed, of course, in which he's going to pour out his own anger and heated wrath against the people of God and against those who resist him during the 70th week of Daniel. And so At that point, we can then begin to realize that the Great Tribulation, and there is good warrant for this, people, so listen up. The Great Tribulation is not tribulation against God's people from God's hand. The Great Tribulation is Great Tribulation or punishment against, not, I shouldn't say punishment, it's wicked, it's bad things happening to God's people or good people at the hands of wicked humans and Satan and bad agents, people who are enemies of God. So God is allowing it to happen, but there are plenty of passages. I don't have time to go through all of them. You can find them all the way back as far as Daniel. But God allows, and then they start picking up again in the prophets, and then we pick them up again in Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, and then culminate in the book of Revelation. God allows Satan to pour out his wrath against God's people for a measured time amount. And God allows Satan to actually overpower the saints, the holy ones, God's people. And in so doing, there's no indication in the Bible that there is a kind of protection from this. There's mass martyrdom. There's mass killing and murdering, and it's horrific. It's the worst time period that's going to ever befall planet Earth for Christians and Jews and anyone else, excuse me, who would resist Satan's agenda. And so then what the pre-wrath positions teaches is that Jesus is going to cut that program short and rescue his bride, and then God will pour out his wrath on the kingdom of Satan and begin to turn the tables and start punishing those wicked people who were persecuting his bride. Okay, so that's kind of the big general picture. So we still retain the principle that in the pre-wrath model, we still retain the principle that God does not punish his bride with his wrath, but we also retain the principle in Scripture that God allows his bride to go through suffering. And we're going to develop this more, so don't worry if you're like, wow, you're going so fast, Ariel, I can't follow you. Show me the chart. Don't worry. This particular thing that I'm talking about is picked up again in a few of the paragraphs down below, so you don't have to worry. Okay, let's keep going. Paragraph 2. Some of these are very short. Some of these are a bit longer. Paragraph 2. Here's the claim made by gotquestions.org. Verses like 1 Thessalonians 5:9 and Revelation 3:10 show that the church will be delivered from the time of trial, i.e. the tribulation. So everything I've been talking about kind of builds now. It's kind of snowballing. Okay, so here we have some more elaboration on what I just talked about. So let's elaborate. What's my response to what the claim is that 1 Thessalonians 5:9 and Revelation 3 show that the church will be delivered from the time of trial? Again, I think here's my answer. I'll kind of prime you for it. It's not necessary to take a position like the post-tribbers and run to the far other side of the 70th week of Daniel, leave the church in place, have us go through everything, and simply disagree with pre-tribbers that God is going to rescue us. What we can have is something where there's a harmonization between what seems to be kind of opposing views of the scripture. So let me just read it for you. In my response, Prewrath agrees that believers are not appointed to God's wrath, right? I quoted earlier 1 Thessalonians 5:9, where Paul writes something that appears to be a description of the eschatological wrath that we are not appointed unto. I think that I have to stop and pull up this verse because it's a key passage now. 1 Thessalonians 5:9. And so let me pull it up for you. It's right here. I pulled in verse 10 as well because in this translation the thought continues. So Paul says, "For God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ." And then verse 10 goes on to say, "Who died for us," right? It's talking about Yeshua, "who died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we will live together with him." End quote. Now, the passage is brought into dispute between pre-tribbers and post-tribbers. The pre-tribbers are making the case that this wrath that God has not destined us for is the eschatological wrath of the 70th week of Daniel. In other words, when I go back over to my chart, they would say that the wrath that Paul's talking about, the pre-tribbers are going to say that God is not destined us to his own wrath, meaning the entire 70th week of Daniel. Post-tribbers say, no, that's not what Paul's talking about. What Paul's talking about is not the eschatological wrath of God. What Paul is talking about is the final judgment, the wrath where we are separated for eternity, the eternal wrath of God at the end of history. And the post-tribbers make that case because they say that the rest of the verse says, but for obtaining salvation. And they say, salvation here is surely eternal. When Paul says, God hasn't destined us to wrath, but for salvation. The post-tribbers, I've heard Joel Richardson say this, he's a post-tribber. In one of his videos, he says, it doesn't make sense that Paul would be comparing eschatological wrath to eternal salvation, because that's kind of a no-brainer. Obviously, when we believe in Jesus, we're saved from eternal salvation, from wrath of, we're obviously saved from eschatological wrath. At least that's what Joel Richard's, the case he's trying to make. So he thinks that instead, what Paul is saying is that in the word wrath, he means eternal wrath, as in day of judgment, at the end of after the millennium and going into, what we call the Great White Throne Judgment. There's a wrath that is represented by those who are sent off into eternal punishment. That's the wrath of God. That's what Joel Richardson believes that Paul's talking about. And the proof, he says, is the context of the salvation word mentioned right next to wrath. Pre-tribbers say, no, the wrath here is eschatological, meaning it's 70th week of Daniel wrath, and therefore the salvation, they must assume, refers to salvation during that time, i.e., the rapture that takes place is a type of salvation from this particular wrath here. Well, what do we pre-tribbers say? We actually follow, again, as I mentioned, as I'm starting to mention in my own article. Let's go back to my article here. We agree that believers are not appointed to God's wrath, but it's crucial to recognize God's wrath begins after the cosmic signs of the sixth seal, Revelation 6:17, a sign that chronologically and sequentially occurs in conjunction with the cutting short of the Great Tribulation. Read Matthew 24:21 and 22. That is divinely appointed unto Israel and the church for the purpose of purification and testing. Move up a little bit here. Purification and testing for separating the wheat from the chaff, but also to serve as faithful witness of how God preserves those who trust in him. The promise, let me pause there then. So what we pre-wrathers are trying to get at is that, like the pre-tribbers, we do agree that the wrath that Paul's talking about in context is the eschatological wrath of the 70th week of Daniel. It doesn't have Paul jumping forward all the way to the end of human history, practically, where we all know that we're going to stand before the judgments, or there will be a great white throne judgment, and we are excused because we are in Messiah. Pre-tribbers teach that that's not what Paul's talking about. And we pre-wrathers believe that that's also the context based on when you look at the passage. At this point in time in Paul's letter, he's already introduced Day of the Lord activities, information that would locate his letter to be of concern within the context for those who are worried a little bit about what's going to happen in their lifetime. What type of judgment is going to come right around the corner. You remember they had this sense of danger from their perspective. Even the Thessalonian churches thought that the persecution that they were going through was an indication that they had already entered into some sort of tribulation or day of the Lord scenario. They weren't quite sure if the rapture had passed them by. They were quite worried and confused. And so Paul had to write these comforting words. In fact, he says in verse 11, therefore encourage one another and build one another up. And I think that is the better context. Indeed, he says in the third part of the verse, so that whether we are awake or asleep, whether awake or asleep, we will live together with him. The context of awake or asleep, that language is resurrection language that he already has talked to them about. And he also is going to continue to further develop this 70th week of Daniel language when he writes the second letter, particularly when he gives them more details about the coming Antichrist person and how that the rapture cannot take place until this Antichrist is revealed and the man of lawlessness and all of these types of things. So I think that the context of the Thessalonian letters is located within the 70th week of Daniel, not necessarily this great overview of those of us who are saved are going to escape the judgment of God. Although, don't get me wrong, I think Paul keeps the overarching eternal judgment in view as well, kind of in the back of his mind when he uses the word like wrath. But I'll give you one last push. Earlier in 1 Thessalonians, in let me back up to chapter 1 and scroll down to verse 10, Paul talks about, he uses rapture language here. And notice he says, wait for his son from heaven. Speaking of God, wait for his son from heaven who does what? Who for what details? What purpose? Wait for his son from heaven whom he raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath to come. And this phrase, wrath to come, seems to be an indicator of the eschatological wrath, not the wrath that will come way at the end of the millennium or way at the end of human history, where all sinners are separated from God for eternity. In other words, eternal wrath. And again, the way I believe, the way I kind of feel assured that this is what he means when he says wrath to come, that he's talking about eschatological wrath, the 70th week of Daniel wrath, is again the context of the book of the Thessalonian letters has the people going through this suffering, this persecution. And in the second letter, Paul picks this up really heavily. He lets them know that, hey, you're going through a hard time, you're feeling persecuted, and you feel that it's unfair. And don't worry, God knows how to pay back those who are punishing you. He's going to pay them back. And the payback that Paul seems to be referring to in the context is not the eternal wrath of God. That's not where God pays them back. Instead, Paul envisions a day of retribution scenario, a day of the Lord situation, where, just like the Old Testament talked about, the day of the Lord in the Old Testament was not pictured as this eternal judgment of God against unrepentant sinners, against all the uns. The Old Testament writers envisioned a day of the Lord that would happen within their lifetime or within the generations of Israel living on planet Earth, where God punished wickedness right in front of them, so we could see it happening. We could read about it. We could understand that it was a part of God's judgment against those who were persecuting us in real time, in our day. In other words, God, bring it now, bring it tomorrow, bring the heat, right? Let all your righteous indignation be poured out against our enemies because they've desecrated your temple and things like that. Just like it happened in Egypt. Right? God punished the Egyptians right then and there. He didn't say, okay, to Israel, just wait. Someday in the sweet by and by, thousands of years from now, you don't know when, during the great white throne judgment, I'm going to punish those wicked Egyptians for what they did to you so long ago, right? Generations later, I'll punish them. In fact, the generation that I punish won't even understand why I'm punishing them, because it'll be so, both the righteous and the unrighteous generations will be so far removed from the bad event that happened earlier that no one will quite know what's even going on. I'll be punishing them after I resurrect them in eternity. I mean, it gets really wonky unless you realize that Day of the Lord scenarios in the Old Testament were written for the purpose of assuring the people right then and there that excuse me. The people right then and there that God's going to punish them. God's going to punish his enemies. In other words, he's going to bring this rescue for us and then punish our enemies, as in when we can see it, when we can witness the punishment. And indeed, Israel witnessed that when the Egyptians chased after them to the Red Sea and God crashed we're reading about this in our Torah portion. Right now we're in the book of Exodus, Parashat Yitro for the Torah portion, where Jethro is the name of the portion in English, Moses' father-in-law. And so we just got through or we're getting ready in the book of Exodus to begin reading about the plagues, or we just read about them, depending on what reading schedule you're on, if you're following a weekly or a triennial or something. So it's hard to say which reading schedule you're on. But point being is, in the Torah portion, we read about that. You've watched the all those movies, Ten Commandments or Prince of Egypt or any of those movies where the story of the Exodus. The people get delivered from Egypt, and then what does God do? He punishes the Egyptians right then and there. That is a day of the Lord activity. So that's kind of what's going on. Didn't mean to prolong that answer. So in regards to Revelation 3:10, the promise in Revelation 3:10 therefore refers to protection from God's eschatological judgment, not an escape from all tribulation or persecution. All right, let's keep going. I don't want to make this too long. I didn't envision that it would be that long, and so I envisioned being able to get through it in one study. Paragraph 3. Again, we're working from the claims that were made by gotquestions.org about the strengths and weaknesses of the pre-tribulational rapture. And if I understand pre-trib, understand Got Questions correctly, they are a pre-trib ministry. So they hold to a pre-trib rapture. Claim. The word church is absent from Revelation Revelation chapter 4 through chapter 21, implying the church is not present during the tribulation. I've heard this response being pushed by pre-tribbers quite frequently, quite prominently, quite confidently, that if John wanted to convey the idea that the church was in the tribulation period, that in the 70th week of Daniel, which the book of Revelation kind of occupies a primary part of the 70th week of Daniel, chapters 4 through 21, then if John wanted to convey that sense, he would have used the Greek word ekklesia, which is the English word church. He would have shown us that, and yet the pre-tribbers over and over will say, do your lookup, guys. The word church is missing predominantly from the book of Revelation. I mean, it's found many, many times up to chapter 4, right, where we got Jesus talking to the seven churches, right? He tells John, write, thus saith the angel of the church of Philadelphia to the seven churches, to the angel of the church of Philadelphia, write this, I know thy works, and thou art faithful, and you have but a little strength. And so he's writing to churches there. And then suddenly in chapter 4, John is told by the Spirit of God to come up here into heaven, and I'm going to show you some things. And pre-tribbers take that language of John coming up to heaven, and they say, this is representative of the church, because John's a believer. This is representative of the church being raptured to heaven. And then from that point on, they say the church isn't on planet Earth anymore. And then we don't see her come back down to earth till after the Battle of Armageddon as the bride that returns out of heaven down, adorning herself. And then she takes her spot next to her husband Yeshua in the millennial kingdom. They rule and reign together. And that's so the pre-tribbers build their case based on the absence of the word church. All right, what's my response? The absence of the word church does not mean believers are absent. The term saints, different Greek word, but the English word, the word saints is repeatedly used to refer to believers during this period, right? You can read Revelation 13:7, which and Revelation 14:12, which you can see obviously is in the middle of Revelation chapter 4 and Revelation chapter 21. We talked about the saints in both of those locations. So just as the word church, and this is a stronger case to be made, so listen up. Just as the word church is missing from other epistles written to believers, it is missing here without implying their non-existence. So this is such an easy study to do, because anyone can do it who has a concordance, or these days if you have computer-assisted programs to help you search the Bible, online concordances or dictionaries or things like that.